Good afternoon, all of you, and good morning to some of you. I'm excited to have an opportunity to be in conversation with all of you again. On behalf of President Obama and the entire My Brother's Keeper Alliance and Obama Foundation family, welcome to our Reimagining Policing Pledge virtual workshop series hosted in partnership with Cities United and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. This series, as you know, is designed to provide educational tools and analysis on the spectrum of policing and public safety options, alternative public safety models, and community-centered review processes. For today's workshop, John Jay College of Criminal Justice's president, Karol Mason, will lead a discussion lifting up findings and recommendations from their brand new, hot off the presses publication with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, otherwise known as NOBLE. We will learn today about new approaches and resources to create policing practices that ensure equal justice for everyone, along with examples of action from some of the nation's most highly regarded police and public safety officials, who I am proud to also call friends and colleagues. It's now my honor to introduce our moderator. Karol Mason has been a legal pioneer and an exceptional voice for equality, fairness, and criminal justice reform. Today, she is the president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Previously, she served as United States Assistant Attorney General and head of the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Program, where she oversaw an annual budget of $4 billion to support an array of state and local criminal justice agencies, juvenile justice programs, and services for crime victims. She also led the Department of Justice's work to address the issue of community trust in the justice system through a variety of programs, including the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, and serving as a founding member of the My Brother's Keeper Federal Task Force, where I had the privilege to meet Karol. So please welcome, to kick off our conversation, my friend and also My Brother's Keeper Alliance Advisory Council member, Karol Mason.
Michael, thank you very much for this opportunity, and welcome everybody to this program. As Michael said, we just released the Future of Public Safety report from John Jay College of Criminal Justice and NOBLE this morning. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to really continue the work. For those of you who don't know about this project, it was designed to figure out how do we create a pathway forward for all of you, the leaders of our cities, for all of you to figure out how do we move forward in this national conversation about creating a better relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. And so what we thought is, let's take it back. Let's talk about what does public safety look like, and find where there's common ground. So we had a series of 6 conversations with leaders across the country and across the spectrum. We had mayors, we had police chiefs, we had union officials, we had advocates, we had philanthropists, we had every voice you could think of represented in the conversation. And the 3 panelists we have here today all participated in that conversation. And so what we're going to do today is the report, someone will put it in the chat for us, but we found 9 common denominators, 9 common principles that we all agreed upon across that spectrum. And so today's challenge is, how do we now take this work and really use it to help you all change the conversation and move forward in creating the communities we all want to live in? And we've got a fabulous panel today. And I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Nadine Gracia, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the Trust for America's Health. But as Michael indicated, Nadine, or Dr. Gracia, is also one of the founding members of the work of My Brother's Keeper. That's where we first met and engaged, and she comes with a public health approach to dealing with these issues. She is a pediatrician and an epidemiologist by training, and she previously served as the Chief Medical Officer for the Health and Human Services Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. She has spent her life working on these issues and focusing on how to reduce violence and provide safe communities. Dr. Gracia is also a former White House fellow, and she served there in the Office of the Health and Human Services in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health and the Office of the Secretary. You'll hear a theme about White House fellows shortly as well. She is a first-generation Haitian American, and she is an advocate for minority health and underserved populations, and lectures nationwide on health disparities and health equity. Our second panelist is Candice Jones, who is the president and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation. Candice, too, was a White House fellow. But Candice joined the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C. as its president and CEO in 2017. Prior to that, she served as a senior advisor at Chicago CRED, an organization that focuses on gun violence in Chicago, the prevention of gun violence in Chicago. And she is working to secure greater investments for violence intervention programs and alternatives to the criminal justice system. Prior to joining CRED, Chicago CRED, she was the director of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, a cabinet level agency in the state of Illinois. And she is, again, a powerful voice on these issues. And our final panelist is Commissioner Danielle Outlaw. I always think it's funny that her name is Outlaw, but she is the Commissioner of Police. She is the head of the 4th largest police department in the country. She has over 6,500 sworn officers and 800 civilians who work in that police department. And she is the first African-American woman to lead the police department in the city of Chicago. She's been a first before as well. She came to Philadelphia by way of Portland, Oregon, where she was the lead police law enforcement person in Portland, Oregon. She is a well-regarded speaker and an in-demand speaker, talking about how to bridge the gap between communities and law enforcement, and looking at race and policing, and making sure that law enforcement is rooted in strong relationships with the communities in which they serve. So she is our final panelist. And with that, I'm going to start with the questions. So this opening question is for all of our panelists, and I will go in the order I just introduced you. Everybody wants the same thing. That was clear through the series of 6 conversations: to be safe. And in the John J. Noble report, we outline the necessity of police working hand in hand with community leaders and healthcare and clinical professionals and others involved in the provision of social services, both public and private. Can you speak to the importance of this type of cross collaboration with regard to public safety, and who needs to be at the table to develop a holistic and sustainable solution? So with that, Dr. Gracia.
Well, thank you, President Mason, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast and beyond. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you for just such an important conversation, and certainly a timely one at that. And I want to commend certainly the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Noble for issuing really this important report. How important is this cross-sectoral collaboration? It is vital. And if anything, 2020 has shown us how vital that cross-sector collaboration is. Whether we look at it through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is disproportionately impacting communities of color and low-income communities, whether we look at it through the lens of the racial reckoning that we are grappling with as a nation, whether we deal with it from the standpoint of the economic crisis that is taking place here and around the world. What we understand is that healthy, thriving, resilient communities really require having the conditions that actually promote health, promote well-being, and promote opportunity and prosperity. And that lies across all sectors. That brings together at the table the public sector through government agencies, the private sector, where the business community has an important role to play, as well as in our community-based organizations and civic organizations, and importantly, the community leaders and members themselves who have the lived experience and often have the solutions to help us in really being able to create those healthy and thriving communities. So it is vital if we are going to truly address and transform and create this more equitable and prosperous future, that we bring together all of these sectors to the table. That's public safety, law enforcement, public health, healthcare, the nonprofit sector, education, transportation, housing, all have a role to play in this. And what was a recurring theme that we certainly saw in all of the sessions that you've held, and certainly in this report, is how vital that is for this to be a sustainable strategy for us moving forward.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Carol. And thanks to everyone, the Obama Foundation, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I want to echo that I think the report is an important tool for all of you practitioners dedicated in service to this issue. I always like to ground these conversations by thinking about how we all define safety for ourselves. And when you think about individuals talking about safety, we seldom describe it as being approached by a paramilitaristic force in some event in response to an action. When we think of safety, we think of the things that are sort of consistent with investment, with in a lot of ways, what we deem in society as privilege. I always say, if you want to know what safe is, go into an affluent neighborhood in any community. The streets are paved, the street lights are on, the businesses are flourishing, there's activity. All these things signal to you, I am safe here. It is all the signs of life. And as professionals, when we're thinking about in communities that need a response to safety, too often the way we respond to safety is really by just focusing on a definition of public safety that is about the over-reliance on that paramilitaristic response. And I think to your point and the point of Dr. Gracia is that we really need to make sure as we're planning that our definition of safety is more expansive and consistent with the way we all know it to truly be. And so that investments, planning, and engagement of stakeholders are more expansive than just this finite singular response, because what we know happens too often is that if you only have a hammer in your toolbox, everything's a nail.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jones. Commissioner Outlaw.
Thank you, President Mason, or the Obama Foundation, John Jay. This is an amazing panel. Let me just put that out there first. I know that's not answering the question, but I really want to say thank you for the opportunity to address questions that, you know, quite frankly, I think people make a lot of assumptions about what us and law enforcement believe our roles are as it relates to the topic that we're talking about. And I think a lot of folks would be surprised if they heard from myself and my colleagues, some of whom I see on the call. They would be surprised in hearing that we too believe that the police shouldn't be called as the answer for a lot of the societal ills that we're seeing here. I think 2020 has shown, I mean, ironically, 2020 is 2020, right? We see things in perfect, you know, hindsight, perfect vision now, but we're really seeing the magnified inequities across the systems. And the police we find ourselves in the middle of all of these discussions or these systemic inequities just because they know we'll respond. We're 24/7. We're always available. We don't have the opportunity or the luxury of saying, nope, we're not going to go to that, right? And so because seeing all of the things that we've seen, now is the time to have these conversations and say, look, when we know that there's an issue with the unsheltered and there are no crimes involved, maybe we need to think about calling those other agencies or those social services agencies that are responsible. Don't just call the police because we know you'll get an answer. So I think it's very, very important to not only have all of the stakeholders at the table that were mentioned by my fellow panelists, but there also has to be a community education and awareness piece as well, because someone has to know that, okay, when I call 911, regardless of what, you know, the new model is going to be, if the police are no longer the ones responding, there has to be a level of comfort amongst the community when they call and expect a certain service. So it goes both ways in managing expectations, but we really have to get back to, again, that same operational or that shared definition of what public safety is. I've done town hall after listening session. I've participated in a lot of panels, a lot of community meetings. And when I ask them, what does being safe look like to you? You know, having a cop on every corner has not been the answer. It just hasn't been. And I was surprised at first to hear things like, well, jobs, housing, education, clean streets, right? And in my mind, I'm like, well, you know, part of me is kind of being a little selfish. So I was like, well, that's not us, you know, because I'm expecting to get pelted each and every time to hear about what we're not doing enough of or what we should be doing. But a lot of the responses that we're getting have absolutely nothing to do with police. But it is important for the police to use our seat at the tables, because we do have a seat at the table as stakeholders with license and inspections or the behavioral health services within the city and all these other places, because we see it first. And we need to say, you know what, here's what we're seeing in these neighborhoods. So when you talk about a comprehensive public safety plan, you can't just keep us out of it. You can't keep the police out of it because we're not first responders, but we have to recognize that we're also a part of the team and we're stakeholders. And we also need to utilize our voices to make sure that we're not only advocating for what we're seeing, but to make very clear the types of calls that we should and shouldn't be responding to. So a seat at the table is important. We have to get out of our silos. And that's why it's important to look at things comprehensively in the manner that you're talking about as it relates to this question.
Thank you very much, Inez. And I hope the audience is hearing this consensus around collaboration and partnership and rethinking what public safety looks like and where investments need to be made. So, Dr. Gracia, research indicates that healthy communities are safer communities, and public resources must be invested in areas that are most likely to create healthy communities. So what investments and initiatives can city leaders make in their communities to reimagine public safety through the lens of public health?
Excellent question. And I think one is thinking about what is the public's health, right? And that is promoting and protecting health and well-being of people and residents in their communities. But it's creating the conditions that actually provide for people to be healthy and reach their full potential for health. And you've heard certainly my co-panelists, Candice, for example, talking about whether it's street lighting or having access to healthy foods, living in healthy housing, that all of those conditions are what are necessary really to create equitable opportunity for people to be able to thrive, for communities to thrive, for there to be a sense of safety. We know that, for example, public health cannot do this alone. And we've been emphasizing the importance of this, of the collaboration, that many of these issues, when we talk about moving further upstream than saying, let's just treat the problem, we have to think about what are the root causes. Is it that we don't have access, for example, to high quality education for all youth, that we don't have access to affordable housing, and really assess what some of those structural inequities are that exist within communities. There have been several initiatives, for example, that have looked at really evidence-based policy solutions that city leaders, that states can really take that actually will help to both improve those conditions, but also help to really advance opportunity and create greater thriving for those communities. Whether that's, for example, access to universal pre-K to start to address, for example, the ability for children to meet their full potential with regards to educational outcomes. That's looking at inclusionary zoning when it comes to housing and ensuring that people have access to affordable housing, because we know, for example, that we are seeing high rates of homelessness, individuals who are suffering from not being able to get into permanent housing, where that is actually critical to their ability to hold down a job, to be able to provide for their families. When we look at, for example, access to healthcare services, that there's disproportionate access even to high quality healthcare services in communities. And this stems from long-standing disinvestment in communities. And so we have to really think about our policy priorities. There are initiatives such as City Health, as well as an initiative that our organization, Trust for America's Health leads, which is called the Promoting Health and Cost Control in States initiative. And these are evidence-based initiatives that actually show that if you invest in these policies, and many of them are actually outside of the health spectrum, they're in education and housing and transportation and food access, that you'll actually see, one, improvements in health outcomes, but you'll also see improvements with regards to the economic vitality of those communities. And so we need to be able to really look at root causes, fundamental structural drivers of inequities, and be able to address those to really see change and transformation and sustainable change and transformation in communities.
Thank you, Dr. Gracia. And again, you'll hear this recurring theme. We're talking to mayors and those who support the work of mayors in how can we help you think about this. So Ms. Jones, we know that mayors can work alongside community organizations similar to what the public welfare has done to bolster public safety in communities. Help us understand what that looks like, what mayors can actually do.
I think I'm going to say two things. One, I think that is sort of good for the audience, which is it's about engagement, really going into communities, working with community members, practitioners, researchers to start to say, What can we scale here to really make a case that there's another way to address every issue? You know, when Commissioner Outlaw was talking, I was thinking of how many police calls are about mental health crisis, and how I know so many people in law enforcement who are like, we don't want those calls. It's sort of not an adequate response to what we know is a health concern. But too often we've plowed so much of the infrastructure and investment to being able to say, we know how to route calls just to this agency so they become responsible for everything, and making sure we start to engage people and have conversations so that we can build infrastructure and route in different directions. The second point, which becomes so important, and I think goes to what Dr. Gracia said, and I'm going to be very intentionally colloquial here, these things take scratch. One of the things that we always do when we're thinking about this other stuff is that this is the pie in the sky stuff, right? We see this as gravy. So when we're carving up our budgets, there's soft things that are the last to be funded and the first to be cut. And the truth is that until we see this level of investment as a core function at the operating level, we won't get the change that we want to see. I am born and raised in Chicago. I know there's some Chicago people on here laughing. And there's one thing in Chicago, if it starts to snow in the city of Chicago and salt trucks are not already on the road, whole administrations may be on their way out as a result of that failure. We have to look at this issue of making comprehensive investments in community safety and health in the same way that we look at that issue of Chicago. It is a non-negotiable if we want to see long-term reductions in violence and sustained improvement in some of the communities that have been hardest hit.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So Commissioner Outlaw, I'm going to pivot and have you talk to us from the lens of being the Chief Law Enforcement Officer. Given the notion that law enforcement should act as guardians of the community, not a warrior against crime, what is the role of police in responding to specific community challenges such as youth violence, addiction, homelessness, and how do you propose we shift the current position of police in communities and reimagine police training in a model to support that shift?
That is a loaded question.
Of
And
course.
and here's why I say that. Because right now, so let's start from the notion that, yes, you're absolutely right. We are guardians. That should be our baseline. And when and if, for whatever reason, we still have to be prepared to shift into warrior, we do that and we go back to guardian baseline because we're protecting and we're serving, right? And I think over the most recent years, we have been forced, there's been so much division, we've been forced to choose. It's either or, and it's an and, right? So because it's an and, we have to not only, and I agree with the responses from the previous question, there needs to be investments in all of those things. But of course, I have to put my caveat out there as a police commissioner or a police chief and say, but I don't think the money should be taken away from the police department, and here's why. In order to have optimal service, you have to invest in your service provider. So whether it's implicit bias training, procedural justice training, whatever the training is, whatever the tools are, all of these things, as my colleague said, cost scratch, right? And we have to prioritize how we budget, where the money goes, so on and so forth. With that said, I think it's important that we realign the resources that we do have, because we know we don't have a blank check. But we have to realign our resources and really focus and pay attention on the types of responses that we have, how we're responding to certain calls, and the type of tools, meaning the training that we're given. It might have been, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but it's still fairly recent. How many police departments do we know that are including a block of instruction on juvenile brain development, right? And understanding our young people? How much are we emphasizing trauma-informed care, or what that looks like in the communities? Or when you see this could be, here's how you interpret that. So I know a lot of folks kind of poo-poo training and say, yeah, well, you can train folks all day, but they are who they are. I think the reality is that we got to stop assuming that people know these things. You have to stop assuming that our young people in the communities have the conflict mediation skills that they need to not automatically pick up a weapon and shoot somebody when you feel like you're disrespecting their social media. That needs to be brought into the schools. Now, again, that the police, we don't, if we're trying to say, let's try to, get the police out of non-criminal matters as much as possible, our schools need to be teaching conflict mediation and resolution, techniques. But again, that costs money. And then what are retraining our officers? How are we responding? Are we co-responding? Are we first responders? Are we responding at all? And again, I think this time, this year, this moment, this movement is asking for us to really be, introspective and say, okay, I know we've done it this way for a very long time, but why have we done things this way? Let's look at how and why the police started, how we evolved, what our purpose was then, what it is now, and what it should be in the next 100 years. That's what we should be doing right now. And I think there's a lot of room for it, but we really are shifting away from the mindset of, again, we're warrior all the time, right? Again, it's protecting and serving. We are of the community. And the only way to truly embrace that is when we sit at the table, recognize that we're not always the ones that have to lead the conversation. Sometimes we have to sit back and be quiet. So there's a lot of things that can and should be done. But I think the key part is recognizing what our role is moving forward as it relates to public safety and how we're envisioning public safety today.
So I want to squeeze in this question because it picks up on what you were talking about to Dr. Gracia. So, Commissioner Outlaw laid the case out well. The question is, what are your recommendations for how we make these transitions from police to health professionals? What does that look like, and help our mayors understand how they can help make that transition that the commissioner is talking about?
Well, the exciting thing is that in some cases that is underway, and we're seeing that type of innovation, right? That is happening. To go to one of the examples that Commissioner Outlaw described was dealing with behavioral health crises, whether that's mental illness, a mental health crisis, or substance misuse and substance use disorder, is how you actually bring together, for example, behavioral health care providers with law enforcement to be able to be responsive to these types of crises. We see examples, for example, of cities and communities where you have indeed for crisis counselors who are actually co-located in a 911 crisis call center, and where those calls that are deemed to be a nonviolent mental health crisis, where actually it's a mobile crisis team that's sent out that is comprised of mental health care professionals, where they're creating hotlines for people to be able to call, to be able to actually address more the mental health needs, as opposed to what might be seen as something in the domain of law enforcement, and having actually care facilities that are available. The thing that we need is to be able to bring this to scale, because this is really of a national magnitude. And that's where we have to have greater investment, for example, in what we really recognize as prevention, because a lot of this has been a fragmentation of systems. You have different systems operating in silos, and so there's not that kind of communication. But when you actually bring these entities together, to be able to identify where there are opportunities to actually partner together and then invest, but those investments have to be sustained. What we grapple with in public health, we often want to say, yes, we want to be the ones where there is that handoff, but public health has been so chronically underfunded for decades. And we're seeing that now, for example, in the context of this pandemic. Being able to access services, being able to have a public health workforce that is able to work with all of these other sectors, we need to actually invest in and do so at the long term. And that's at all levels, at the local, at the state, and at the federal level, to really be able to see the type of robust, comprehensive, and holistic response that really is needed. Because we cannot criminalize these types of health problems, because we'll just continue to be in a recurring cycle over and over again of people who really actually need other needs met through services that can be met, for example, through public health and healthcare. But that unfortunately, if those services don't exist or aren't tapped into, that we'll just continue to see these recurring cycles of people either going back and forth into the prison and jail, or being homeless, and asking our law enforcement to address those more systemic societal issues, which really should be addressed through other sectors.
Thank you, Dr. Gracia. Ms. Jones, I want to ask you this question. How might city leaders better center the voices of the community members that they're serving and empathize with their lived experiences and use that perspective to inform public safety initiatives? Because we know from the literature and we know from the conversations that community involvement has a role in public safety as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important. And I think there are a couple of really concrete things. You know, we can say generally we want to engage people, we want to have conversations, which I do think is important. You're seeing throughout our society, and it's not just specific to this conversation, an increasing lack of trust in institutions. And unless we engage and move into communities and really listen, each of us as system leaders contribute to that distrust. And so we really have to do some work to repair that harm. Concretely, I think that we can make sure we have investments that naturally engage that voice. One of the reasons our institution is always holding up models like the Arch's work in New York, Credible Messengers, some of the work that was done in Oakland through Measure Y and Measure Z to reinvest in people who were proximate, had once been involved in high-risk behavior and violence, and making them the professionals that were sometimes engaging as intervention specialists in communities was really important, both because they had legitimacy in the communities that they were working in, but also because it gave them a seat at the table to really engage with leaders about what needed to happen in what communities and what they were seeing on the ground. And I think it will be important to have sort of forums which, you know, municipal leaders are going into their communities and hearing, but also having concrete initiatives where people can start to see that investment. And with that, Carol, I'm going to take the end of this to circle back, because Lord knows I want to tack in with my co-speakers on a point. And I think this is an incredible panel. It's a great conversation. But I want to note that if you're keeping score, and I am, in the last 40 years in this country, there has been an exponential growth in the amount of money that we spend in policing, in courts, in corrections. And I think there's a lot of debates on that investment in incapacitation and its net result for the very communities that we were mostly targeting for that intervention. In my mind, and I take full responsibility for this position, I'm not owning anybody else's position. If we want to start investing in other things and reducing the reliance on systems, which I am an advocate for. I ran a correctional system in the state of Illinois, spent a ton of time. So I'm not speaking what I did not do. I advocated loudly to ensure that there was a continuum of care and there was some place that we could send youth so that ultimately all youth were not sent to me. But I also took the position that if we were no longer the only tool in the toolbox, then we could not also say that we needed to continue to grow our budget at the same rate. And that is something that we are going to have a realistic conversation about in these city and municipal budgets.
Thank you. So we want to leave time for audience questions. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists this closing question and start with Commissioner Outlaw. From your perspective and your perspectives of law enforcement, healthcare, and nonprofit leadership, what is the role of public safety in the 21st century, and how can we use this John Jay and Noble report and these conversations to venture on our path to progress? Because this conversation today, this town hall, is about how we move forward, not a discussion of where we are, but how do we move forward? So Commissioner Outlaw, you have the power. What would you do?
With my magic wand. And I just want to acknowledge, thank you for the shout out to my hometown, Oakland, California, and what's being done around Measure Y and Measure Z and ceasefire. And I'm trying in phases to bring a lot of what we know worked there here to Philadelphia on a larger scale. With that said, though, one, I think we need to have a shared understanding of what public safety is, right? That's very clear. But we have to embrace us in law enforcement, we have to embrace that our role may change. And it's already changing, right? And a lot of the resistance that you see is because of uncertainty, and no one has made clear what's expected of us. On one hand, you hear defund. On the other hand, you hear abolish. And then you hear silence, right? So I think we need to be in a shared space and understand across the board where we are, what's expected of us, and what our roles are. I think we've already pointed out there's clear consensus around the fact that we don't think that police should be responding to everything, right? Whether it's, again, those who are unhoused, those who are in crisis that don't pose a threat of violence or harm to themselves or others. We have to figure this out. There has to be an intentional, looking at the types of calls that we respond to. And this is going to take some time, some research and money, right? The types of calls we respond to, and then say, okay, this is the most appropriate response. A lot of the agencies are already doing this. When I left Portland, we put someone in the radio room or the dispatch center so we can triage the calls. And we ensured that our sworn folks weren't being sent to calls where other practitioners can be going. And we started that triage program here. So we can now inform our co-responder pilot that'll be rolled out by the beginning of the year. But with that said, we have to have a very clear understanding of what public safety is. Leaders like myself and leadership within police departments have to be willing to have the very, very difficult conversations. And sometimes it's just listening sessions and we're just listening. We're not offering any suggestions, we're listening, and it's very difficult. If a lot of you are like me, I absorb a lot of the energy that I get from the room. And these conversations and these meetings are emotional roller coasters because you have people experiencing a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. There's a lot of healing that has to take place. And we have to remember as law enforcement not to take this personally, because every now and again, most times than not, there's nuggets in there. When you have your note takers, there's nuggets in there that helps us inform our policy in the short term, but also helps us inform what we'll be doing moving forward. So I would say most importantly, we have to be willing to be in the room, hear from community, hear from those folks with lived experience. It might not come out in the best way. It might not be articulate. It might not be polished, but these are the ones that are experiencing the very things that we're trying to move and get away from. So we have to be willing to listen. We have to step up and be leaders and sometimes show vulnerability and, be willing to say, I don't know what I don't know. Oh, you know what? I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. Would you be willing to sit on this panel or this, whatever this working group is with us to help us and include community to inform policy moving forward? So those are some things that we can do in the short term, but I would say overall, we in law enforcement leadership, and it has to go push all the way down to the line level, we have to be willing to listen, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that sometimes these conversations aren't going to be comfortable. We're not going to hear what we want to hear. We're not going to always walk out feeling warm and fuzzy because we do have a role in this, but it's not all bad because we're all working towards the same goal. We're not adversaries. We're partners at the table.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Dr. Gracia.
Just to, I think, actually capture on one of the points that Commissioner Outlaw was talking about with regards to listening and one, the importance of acknowledging that these inequities did not happen overnight and listening to communities and really hearing their voice with regards to what are the greatest barriers and obstacles and challenges and inequities that they're facing. And recognizing that the agenda you may come in with may be very different from the agenda of the community. And it reminds me, for example, of work, that the California Endowment did through its Building Healthy Communities initiative, where in one of its communities, it had plans in mind with regards to how to support and build healthy communities. And yet many of the youth leaders were saying, we are concerned about the suspensions and expulsions that are happening in our school system that are disproportionately impacting students of color. And in listening to them, the foundation said, we have to address these issues because these are the priority issues that are being raised by the community members. And so it's recognizing too, the communities know what are some of the most pressing issues that are facing them and challenging them, and bringing together to the table those that can actually help work on those issues. When we collect data, we can't just collect data to issue reports, we have to use that data to drive action, use that data to drive evidence-based policies that are going to actually be able to help improve opportunity and health and well-being for our communities. And then those systems need to be held accountable. It cannot be that we create the initiatives or have the collaboratives, and yet there's not accountability to actually follow through, not only in sharing the information, but demonstrating what the impact is and being flexible and nimble enough to adjust when that is needed, but also recognizing that the investment, that the collaboration, and that this cannot be short-term, that it has to be long-term, that we have to have the will of leadership engaged in this, and it can't be cyclical, because that's what's actually continuing these ongoing disparities, is that we have these cyclical investments, but not these long-term, much needed investments and opportunities for communities. And so public health has a role to play, but every sector really has a role to play in ensuring that we create that foundation and use, for example, a report such as the John Jay College and Noble report to lead us in that way.
Thank you, Dr. Gracia. Ms. Jones, before we go to Q&A.
I won't restate what my esteemed panelists have said, because they've sort of eloquently laid out that engagement, listening to communities is critically important. So then I'll spend the balance of my comments on talking about what's required once you've heard. Because I think as public officials, a danger, and one of the things, to a point I was making earlier about sort of there's so much mistrust in government, is that we listen and then we never actually get to the action. And I think so much of what we're seeing and hearing in communities is that they want to start to see yesterday, sort of immediately, some actionable things. And I think many of us know, and as Dr. Gracia just laid out, it doesn't happen overnight, the change we want to see. But I do think it's really important that we lay out and articulate a plan that has some near-term deliverables that are communicated and executed on, along with midterm and longer-term goals. Because there's an exigence here. And I think one of the reasons people frustrate, they leave the table, is because they don't see or believe that the action required is coming. And so I think we also need to make sure that we're articulating and then executing on some low-hanging fruit. An example I'll give is that the Arches program, which was a program run out of New York City probation, when it launched, it was really about sort of probation getting more proximate to community and hiring and employing people from the community, reconstructing their offices to make sure that the physical plant wasn't a barrier to the very people that they wanted to serve. They also said to the folks, they got some money from the city and said, what do you want? And they were surprised to find that many communities that they were working in said, we want art spaces. We want spaces in our community that are dedicated, just like the kinds of murals and things that you see downtown that say, similar to how we all started, that signal investment. And so they took money from the city and partnered and created art spaces. It was an immediate way to say to the community that they were working in, we hear you, we're responding, while at the same time putting into place some of the longer term systemic changes that they were going to see. And I think it's going to be really important in this work, as folks are working, that they have some of those different pillars so that people stay engaged in it with you, because legitimately there's a lot of exhaustion around conversation and whether or not we're going to get to action.